Self-Storage, conveniently located near the Harmon McDonald's. We offer affordable rates, online payments, and auto bill pay for your convenience. Plus gate access daily from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Call us today at 648-7867 for more information.
Good morning, Guam, and thanks for starting your day the KUAM way. Group chat. We'll jump right into it. Part 4 of our discussions on decolonization with the Executive Director of the Commission on Decolonization, Melvin, Borja. See Benny.
You got to tell that backstory because people are not going to have it.
Nah, you got. That'll be a deep cut later. So we'll just jump right into it, man. We kind of left off last week talking about faith-based organizations and how the end game of decolonization and kind of the things involved with it really go hand in hand with what a lot of these faith-based works
so
are
the last conversation we were really focused on Mililani Trask's panel at the Fanhita conference.
Right.
And part of that panel, she mentions the involvement of faith-based organizations as being a major supporter of the Native Hawaiian movement. And she talks about how when they didn't have the support that they needed politically, they went back to their roots, back to the places that have always supported them. And so she talks about how it was a real natural fit for their churches to get involved, primarily the Christian and Protestant churches, because the vast majority of Native Hawaiians are either Christian or Protestant. And so she talks about how their missions really are in line with the missions of decolonization, in the sense that churches often defend human rights, they often provide social service, they put an emphasis on education, on treating humans with dignity. And so these are all things that really do jive organically together. And
right.
So what I really wanted to, I don't really want to get into the weeds about the church itself, but I think that what's important is that I think that when you look at what the missions of these churches set out to do in our community, these are the same things that we are attempting to accomplish with decolonization. And so I think that it's definitely something that is potentially very powerful. When the churches get involved in any community issue, it's huge. And the church has a way of really galvanizing the community in that way. And so, I think that it would be a fantastic thing for people who are involved in faith-based, community outreach to engage on the decolonization front. It's a very natural fit in terms of, for example, let's say with the Camelin Caradot mission, right? It's a church-based service.
Right. And
it targets primarily, people who are houseless, who are hungry, right? And their whole mission is to provide food, access to hygienic showers and whatnot, right?
Yeah.
And so this whole thing is not, they don't question these people. Oh, do you have a job? Are you on drugs? X, Y, or Z. There's no interview process. Are you hungry? That's pretty much it. You know what I mean? Are you hungry? Are you in need? And I think that this is something that's very in line with what we do, right? That's what we're all about, is trying to find ways to empower our people, right? The whole point of that mission is to satisfy some basic needs of individuals so that they can take the next step into elevating their lives. And what we are trying to do with decolonization is very similar, in the sense that we have to establish these parameters where we are going to satisfy these basic human rights. Same thing with education, right? For obviously the Catholic Church has a whole system of education, from pre-K to 12th grade.
Right.
And so when you look at the way that they justify their access or their ability to conduct this system, right, is that they're aligning their faith-based beliefs with their educational values, which is very similar to what we are attempting to do, right? We are attempting to align our educational values with our political values. And so, these types of things, I think, are a very natural fit. It's not necessarily to say that the churches should take this up, or that we should be in the churches, but I think that it's the responsibility of any organization that is attempting to solve a community-based issue to understand how decolonization can impact that and how it can further the effectiveness of their mission.
Well, one way I think that we're very fortunate here as well in Hawaii, they may not have had the political backing on Guam, we are fortunate in that I think it's safe to say a vast majority of our elected leaders support decolonization.
Right.
So we haven't had to really go to these churches with our hat in our hand and
Right.
powwow. But I do see what you're saying in the similarities of what their end game is and what decolonization's end game is. So let's make that leap and let's look at some of the comparisons and the way they address problems and the way decolonization would kind of address similar issues.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a great idea. When, let's take for example, when I think that let's take some controversial issues like abortion and marijuana, right? These are obviously issues, and I think it's a great example because in this juncture, we've seen the church kind of at odds with the popular vote, right? I mean, that has happened. We've seen it, and so, but in the same breath, they utilize their power base, right? Their congregations to create political power, right? So if they stand behind an issue, and we see this all the time. Those of us who attend services, you hear the messages embedded even in the sermons, right? I mean, there's been instances where church leaders have outright come out and said who to vote for.
Right.
Or what to vote
Or
on,
who to
how
not
to
vote for.
who to not vote for,
Right.
right? And so, I think it's a very similar political process in that sense. I think that we would be naive to believe that the church is not politically powerful. But going back to what you're saying, you're right that our decolonization issue in terms of politics is very nonpartisan.
Right.
We don't separate political status. It's not like, one party supports decolonization and another doesn't, so that when one party is in administration, that's the direction that our government moves. I think we've seen that whether the leadership is Republican or Democrat, whether the majority in the legislature is Republican or Democrat, we all have this consensus that we want to pursue decolonization. And I think that that's something very similar with the way that the church operates, right? Is that there can be obvious differences, within the congregation, but once the leadership of the church is very clear on their stance,
Right.
and the congregations tend to follow. They fall in line, and obviously some people do, some people don't, but I think the majority do. And so when we think of this, is what I think this is what I'm really trying to get at, is that if we can engage our faith-based community in a way that really is deliberate about how the work of decolonization really does protect the rights of human beings. It really does advocate
God-given
for
rights.
Yeah, God-given rights, inalienable God-given rights. I mean, I think that these are important aspects of the work that we do that really do fall in line with people's, spiritual understanding and spiritual perspective, which is a very powerful thing. I think that we would be remiss to believe that faith does not affect the way that we see things. Our spiritual beliefs obviously have an impact in the way that we intellectualize things and the way that we articulate them. And, it's just a part of the human dynamic.
Hey, we got a poll up here. Should faith organizations get involved in self-determination? Yes, no, unsure. So basically, if you feel like, and correct me if I'm wrong, if you feel like we need to have more preaching from the pulpit about decolonization, then I would just go ahead and check yes. And you're right. I feel like a lot of if you read the Bible, a lot of the teachings in the Bible kind of center around, how many times were they fleeing from oppression?
Right. And I think that
decolonization?
And even in more recent times, we've seen that we have for the sake of argument, we've got a very progressive pope.
Right.
I mean, the Pope has been very strong on his advocacy of the defense of the most vulnerable of our population. And that's really what decolonization is about. Decolonization sets out to address and advocate for those who are most vulnerable. It is ultimately the colonized population that continues to feel the effects of, this colonial action. And we can see, nowadays, if you look at our community, right, you look at the colonized people of Guam, the native inhabitants are the people who fill the prisons at the highest numbers. They're the people who suffer from the most non-communicable diseases. We're the people who have the highest rates of drug addiction, domestic violence, poverty, homelessness. I mean, you name it. And these are all manifestations of the colonial impact, right? Colonization sets to disempower a population, remove the power and place it somewhere else. And when that happens, you know, you have a people who are really surviving off of their most basic needs. And so that's the way that I look at the work of decolonization. Also, that's something that I believe that we can learn from faith-based organizations, is that faith-based organizations have a very clear focus on service. Right? It's not just preaching from the pulpit. They also go out into the community and really try to address these basic needs. You know, I'm a big fan of the Black Panthers. They just celebrated an anniversary of their breakfast program for kids. So a while back, when they were experiencing this lack of real political power in their community, their assessment was that their community was living on their most basic survival needs. And so when you're living, you know, paycheck to paycheck, when you're just trying to keep food on the table, it's really difficult to start thinking about politics and civil rights. And so what they did was they started to address that need directly by feeding kids, giving them breakfast, you know, providing turkeys on Thanksgiving, giving Christmas gifts to kids in the hood. You know, and this created real political power, because what it did was it helped the community see that the Black Panther Party was really trying to help them. That they weren't just talking that game, you know. And so that's something that I think that we need to be better about. You know, we need to be able to be very deliberate about how we engage our community, not just with education, but also with service. I mean, what better way to educate people than with service that really impacts their lives in a tangible way?
Mel, I know that you get your share of naysayers and people who watch this, it's a common argument that I hear on the other side of things is, oh, well, you know, what does the United States being the administering power over Guam have to do with, you know, the average Joe Cruz who's out there addicted to ice, homeless?
I think that that's a really great and very important question. You know, kind of referencing back earlier where I was talking about how our native inhabitant population is really the key demographic that suffers the most from these types of social ills, right? Including drug addiction. And so let's just take that example. I think that, you know, when you look at a population that has a drug problem, you know, drugs are everywhere in every community. But when you see drugs become an epidemic, it often comes with certain realities within that community. And ours is no different than any other hood, any other ghetto in the United States, where you have people who are suffering from severe rates of poverty, you know, from lack of access to basic needs like healthcare, education, housing. You know, when these types of things become, when they are not a baseline, when they become something that is unattainable, it creates an epidemic in your community.
Right.
And so when we think about decolonization is not going to go, you know, it's not going to solve the drug problem directly. What it will do is that it will improve the basic living conditions, the quality of life of the community, and so that's ultimately what it is.
It's kind of like the high tide raises all boats.
Right.
Thing,
right. If we can elevate the state of our communities, then we start to eliminate some of these extra problems that really they stem from the lack of access to these basic things.
Well, I mean, you take something like the Jones Act and the cost of living and the price of food, and that's got a great impact. And you know, you kind of status quo, right? So there's these arguments about keeping the status quo, which I feel like we've successfully addressed over the course of these last few Facebook Lives. But when you look at a simple statistic like every child on Guam gets a free school lunch and a free school breakfast because we're so poor. Guam is so poor.
Right.
And I just don't understand how people don't see that we're so poor in so many areas, and here we are in this political relationship that some people say should be the be-all, end-all status quo, and it just doesn't pay the dividends that I think we need. You know what I mean?
Right, and I think, you know, in line with that argument also is that, you know, a lot of times people say, well, what would Guam do without all of this, you know, without this federal piggy bank, right? Without all this federal funding. But I think, you know, when we talk about that aspect, we have to include the reality that federal funding is discretionary. You know, it's not like even the federal money that we get is never guaranteed. None of it is ever guaranteed. It's really at the discretion of Congress, of the federal government, about whether or not they want to release this funding, how much of it they want to release.
Is like compact impact reimbursements or
Right.
Medicaid, Medicare. And,
Absolutely, right. I mean, even
so
within
we're not guaranteed a baseline amount of federal money.
right. That's something that I think a lot of our community is misinformed about. I think that we have this idea like, oh, well, you know, the United States made this deal with the freely associated states, which allows them to, you know, to freely migrate into Guam and have access to all government services. And so since they made this deal, then, you know, we guarantee have this money, right, to deal with the impact of it. But we've seen over the years that that's not the case. That's not how it works at all. And so, you know, and even most recently the case with the miscalculation of the formula, and now DOI is saying, oh, Guam is going to pay,
Right.
you know, pay the penalty for it, which is, I mean, I think that we've seen time and again that the relationship is not an equitable relationship.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, the U.S. is going to do what they got to do to stay ahead of the game. That's why they're, you know, at the
Right.
top of the heap. And you look at the compact impact. I mean, our estimate is over $1 billion. I think is the impact,
Right.
right? I know that interns at the Public Policy Institute. I attended this presentation where it's basically, I mean, let's just throw a number out there. Let's say it's $1 billion that we feel the impact of the immigration from the freely associated states is. That's the burden on our government over the last, you know, X amount of years. But Uncle Sam is saying something like, "Oh no, we only owe you like 12 million."
Right, they operate on a formula and there's a cap on it, right? Which is very different than the way that the formula operates in the States.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think that that's something that we have to be very realistic about, right? And so when we talk about decolonization and change in status, it doesn't necessarily mean that federal funds dry up. It just means that we have to negotiate for how that you know, federal piggy bank is going to operate. And arguably, the funding between the funding transfer between the government of Guam and the U.S. federal government could realistically improve with decolonization, with the change in status, any change in status, be it independence, free association, statehood. There are opportunities for each of those models to create a new set of negotiations and that, in effect, create a new reality for us.
Right, but that's on the other side of the decolonization process, right? So
Right.
people, and we talked about this as well. When you say decolonization, they automatically think, "Oh, Uncle Sam's going to pack up and leave, and that's
Right.
it. We're all going to die."
Yeah, right, absolutely, and I think that
I just want to. Bear's been. What's up, Bear? Half a day. I wonder if 95% of the people are scared of even having a conversation just due to the risk of losing support from the U.S. I also wonder if the same 95% of people are complaining about the same issues facing the island communities and the people in Guam not being safe and the same anymore. I think that, yeah. How many conversations have you started about decolonization and they've only ended a few minutes later because you just hit this wall of like, oh, the U.S.
the
is
China
gonna
wall,
leave,
you hit the wall of China.
Oh, China. But you know,
China's
it's,
gonna
I mean,
invade
you bring up China, so look at the Federated States of Micronesia, right? So their covenant with the United States is running out, and so we just had the interior guys over there, I mean, pretty much laying out the red carpet
Oh,
for
yeah,
the
absolutely.
FSM.
Right.
And then just a couple days ago, you have China now making overtures because they want to build a base that's as big as significant as, you know, naval base Guam here. So
Right.
the way I look at it is like if you look at the FSM, who clearly right now at this moment has the power to negotiate the best deal for them, and you see that, I mean, it's their table. They've
Right.
got the United States coming, they got China coming, and you know, Guam, it's kind of made me, I mean, I have a weird sense of humor, but I interviewed the governor a couple of months back about these negotiations, and she had said, like, yeah, Chris, you know, we wrote to the FSM leaders trying to just see if we can kind of sit in on this process. And so here we have, I mean, just a couple stone throw away, you know, the FSM is,
Right.
I mean, getting wined and dined by, you know, the,
Right.
I mean, basically the top two superpowers in the world. And here we are saying, like, can we just get our foot in the door, you know?
Right. Can we
This is
just be
crazy.
an observer? And that
It's
even
nuts.
that, right? I mean, you know, when we've met with our administration has met with the leaders of the FSM, Palau and RMI, and we've expressed these concerns that, you know, we want to maintain healthy diplomatic relations between us. I mean, historically, we've always had a connection with our
Right.
neighbors in Micronesia. You know, there's no reason for us to to just destroy all of that history. But we also recognize that the political dynamic has changed, and the way that we connect and the way that we exchange is very different. And a lot of it deals with the fact that we are not sovereign within our own borders. We don't decide for ourselves how this is going to work. Our side of the agreement is always negotiated for us by the United States. And so when you look at, you're exactly right. In this situation, you know, all of these nations are politically powerful in this situation, whereas we are politically absent. And so, you know, if we've, you know, to kind of put more backstory into this, the governor also wrote directly to the Secretary of State asking to be involved in the compact negotiations, and she said that she is willing to just be an observer, just to be there. She just wants to be there.
Get in the room.
Right.
Yeah, fly on the wall.
The funny thing about this is that the Secretary of State's response was to take it up with your delegate.
Right.
Our non-voting representative delegate, that one.
See how that works out for you.
And so that was literally the end of that conversation.
Right.
Whereas on the other side, she did approach our FAS neighbors and said, hey, you know, we would like to be involved, and if the U.S. won't bring us in, will you bring us in? And
hey, this is my friend Guam.
Yeah, and they're willing. You know, that's the funny
We're just
thing
here to
about
watch.
it. The funny thing about it was there was consensus across the board from the leadership of all the FAS states that they are willing to include us, for us to be involved, because they recognize that things have become very contentious between us,
right.
and it's because of this compact issue.
That's crazy that it's so contentious between us, and a big part of it is because of the immigration, and we have no control over it, and it's something the United States negotiated.
Which is something that we could have solved had we not seen our Commonwealth Draft Act destroyed. Let's not forget that the two things that killed the Commonwealth Draft Act were immigration and mutual consent. Those are two things that would change the entire landscape of this conversation.
Right. And those are two things that, when you go back to what we were talking about earlier with how decolonization could affect different ills that we deal with. I mean, immigration, if we have more control over immigration, this could be a totally different island.
And it's not like, you know, even when we talk about immigration, you know, I think a lot of people kind of get this idea that, immigration means that we're going to just seal up the border, you know what I mean? And that's going to seal up the border, and we're going to start deporting people.
Right, yeah. No.
But, you know, I think that realistically, when we look at what is the island way to answer this problem, you know, the way that is culturally appropriate for us is that we figure out a way to establish inafamalik, right? How does it work for all of us? How do we create balance and reciprocity? And I think that we can find creative solutions for these problems. We just don't have the political power to enact those solutions. You know, I think that there's a very high need for, you know, just basic job life transition skills training. There's a lot of people who come from, you know, our neighboring islands who are not prepared to enter the job force. You know, they don't have the basic skills to go in and apply for a job, to know how to even apply for the social services that is available to them. I think that we also got to figure out, you know, this has to be a part of the agreement. It has to be set in stone that if this is going to happen and we are going to bear the burden, that we are not going to have to just figure it out. Right. You know, I mean, especially if we're not involved in those negotiations.
Well, so Mel is committed. I can say that we've committed to more discussions on decolonization.
Yeah, definitely. I think these are great.
Yeah, so we're gonna actually take next week off because it's Christmas Eve, and trying to get some heads up, some kind of Christmas singing involving Sabrina's made an early commitment to do some solo numbers.
Wow.
She's gonna kill me after this. Yeah, so I want to bring you a little Christmas on Christmas Eve, and then we'll jump back on with Mel, and maybe we'll just do another 4 discussion on decolonization, because I like it. I think it's good to get the information out there. And hey, if you're watching, I know Bear, and we've had our host of regulars, but you know, share the broadcast, especially to kind of generate that discussion that we're having here. I think that it's cool for me and Mel to sit here and talk about this stuff, but you know, the end goal is to have you guys do the same thing out there. So, hey, Mel, if I don't get to see you, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Good talk. I like the way you put it all together. I know we're kind of figuring out how to, connect the dots before, but as always, very eloquently put, Mel.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And thanks you guys for watching. I got a busy news days to get to, so we'll catch you. Remember, start your day, every morning the KUAM way with starting lineup. I'm done. That's
Adios.
Joss.